Since Charizard's already in the game, I figured it's only a matter of time before Blastoise and Venusaur also make it into Scarlet and Violet. And while I've already covered Charizard on the channel, that was before the game even came out, so in today's video I'm going to revisit Charizard as well as the other two Gen 1 starters, so we can get an idea of the potential competitive viability of these in the Terra meta. So starting with Blastoise, we have a mono water type, which mono types typically do not have the greatest offensive stab, and we can see that here, as there are more Pokemon that resist water than are weak to water. But the super effective stab is at least on some rather popular typings like fire and ground. This typing is, however, pretty good defensively, because it's only weak to grass and electric, two typings that typically are not run together, and it also resists four typings, which, considering water is one of the most popular defensive Terra types, Blastoise is going to be quite defensive just as a water type in general. Now, as for Terra types for mono water, I actually imagine grass or electric would be ideal. Either one of those gives you offense onto water and would completely switch up your defensive weaknesses. But even a typing like dragon could be beneficial if you want to keep with the defensive typing, or even just water to go for stronger water type stab. That could also be quite beneficial here. Now, Blastoise is not in the Gen 9 decks currently, so we don't have its moveset for Gen 9, so this will be more speculative. But it should maintain its abilities, that being Torrent, which is on every water type starter, and Rain Dish, which essentially gives you leftovers recovery if you're in rain. Now, a defensive, more supportive Blastoise would probably prefer to run Rain Dish, whereas a more offensive Blastoise might benefit from running Torrent. Now, if we look at the stats, it is quite a defensive Pokemon. We have very good special defense as well as quite good defense paired with a reasonably high HP stat. And while the special attack is higher than the physical attack, it's a negligible amount higher. So you could essentially run this as either a special attacker or a physical attacker. But if you're wanting to make use of some of its stronger water type moves, special attack is probably going to be the ideal stat to invest in. Now, the speed stat is actually not bad, and there's ways you can get this stat to work quite well for Blastoise. Because if you max out the investment in the speed with a speed boosting nature and 252 EVs plus a choice scarf, you can actually get this speed stat over 200, so you could have it outspeed some pretty big threats in the meta. And choice scarf is not a very common thing to run on Blastoise, so it would definitely be a surprise. Now, most of the interesting moves for this come in the form of egg moves. In Sword and Shield, this had access to Fake Out as well as Aqua Jet and Water Spout, and even some other defensive moves like Mist and Yawn as egg moves. So the best way to maximize the utility of this Pokemon is with the moveset that it can acquire from egg moves. Now, another good move this had access to, which it will probably keep in Gen 9, is Shell Smash, which doubling that speed stat using Shell Smash could actually make it quite fast. And assuming you pair it with redirection so it does not get hit by an attack while it goes for Shell Smash, you could go for full power water spouts that will be hitting extremely hard. Now, this Pokemon does have a lot of moves, many of which you would not use, such as Dig, or even like Mega Punch, Mega Kick, stuff like that. Some of these, however, are potentially quite useful. If you were to run a physical Blastoise, for example, Rock Slide is a great option here, especially with a Shell Smash build, because you could go for the very annoying flinch tactics with Rock Slide. This does also get Icy Wind as a form of speed control, Helping Hand is another good supportive move for this Pokemon. Muddy Water is also a great option. It gets a lot of different coverage like Dark Pulse and Dragon Pulse, so just a lot of moves really. I doubt it's going to keep Scald though, because Scald got taken off of a lot of Pokemon in Gen 9. Body Press is also a fun one. Which, Body Press is interesting because this does get Iron Defense, and it does have a pretty good defensive stat, so a really interesting option to go for sure. So this Pokemon gets pretty much all the good water moves that you could want, even though I highly doubt it's going to keep Scald. It most likely will get access to Chilling Water, but I'm not certain about the other new moves from Gen 9. So Blastoise is an interesting multi-role. It's typically been used as a fake out support with a surprise Shell Smash mode, where you bait protecting in front of it with the fake out so that you get a free Shell Smash. Which, as we've seen with Torkoal, having that 150 power spread move plus the Terra type boost makes for an incredibly offensive Pokemon that, whether the hit's resisted or not, it kinda doesn't matter. It will do a lot of damage to just about anything outside of the super bulky Assault Vest builds like we see with Iron Hands. And Blastoise could play very similarly with Shell Smash and Water Terra type. So it could be good in a rain team for that reason as well. Just know that if you're running this offensive, this is likely replacing Palafin, which, given how strong Palafin is, I'm not entirely sure if it's ideal to give that up to try to make an offensive Blastoise as your sweeper. But this does make a good support. It has a good set of moves for it. Having access to Fake Out and Yawn is very annoying, and it has enough offensive stat that it could chip away at something with, say, Muddy Water over time. Now, this is not as impressive as some of the new legendaries or paradox forms that we see in Scarlet and Violet, but it's certainly not bad. And I think depending on the team, this Pokemon would make for a very useful support for specific teams. But if this were going on a tier list, it probably would be no higher than a B tier, just because it's not as impressive as some of these new Pokemon in Gen 9. So next is Venusaur, which has a much more offensive poison grass typing. As you can see, just based on the percentages, it's considerably better than Mono Water offensively. And you still have that super effective on ground, which is nice. But now you also have the super effective on Fairy, which, given how common Fairy type is in Gen 9, that's a good super effective to have. Defensively, this is weak to 4 typings, but it does have a relatively decent amount of resist as well. So it's kind of a balanced typing, not super offensive, but offensive enough to be quite useful. And it's not the most defensive typing out there either, but it's still a pretty good typing to work with. And I imagine that Water would be a great defensive Terra for this, as well as possibly Electric. And oddly enough, even Poison Terra type does not seem too bad on this, because while you still would have the weakness to Psychic, it would eliminate the Flying, Fire, and Ice weakness and replace that for Ground, which, given how Grass is super effective on ground, you actually could get away with Poison, and then go for very strong Poison type attacks onto the Fairy types in the meta. So I think this actually has some interesting options, obviously depending on how your team is built, but just off the top of my head, I do see a variety of Terra types you could go for here. Venusaur has the Grass Starter special in the form of Overgrow, and then Chlorophyll, which is a very good ability. Doubling the speed stat makes this a very fast Pokemon and a very annoying one to deal with, because that speed stat is 80, which, doubling that, you essentially have equivalent to a 160 base speed stat, which very few Pokemon can naturally outspeed, and this would be faster than a Fluttermane, which actually becomes a bigger issue if the highest stat on the Fluttermane is speed. Venusaur actually cannot outspeed it because its ability activates in harsh sunlight. The Paradox forms really affect the speed gimmick that Venusaur has, but outside of like the really fast Paradox forms, it will be able to outspeed a lot of the other ones, Now, the special attack is better than the physical attack by a decent amount, so you most likely would run special, and considering the moves this gets, you probably just want to run special. Defensively, the special defense is a little bit better as well, so you're more likely to live an earth power than an earthquake, just based on the defensive spread here. The stat distribution is pretty okay, but definitely nothing special compared to how some things are set up in Gen 9. Now, one popular move this Pokemon tends to run, especially in Gen 8's meta, was that of Sleep Powder, which it's not quite as consistent as Spore, but there is no Spore user as fast as Venusaur. So having access to those really fast Sleep Powders is quite useful, even if it is a bit risky. And every time you see Lilligant, it's almost always running Sleep Powder, and is almost always next to Torkoal. So a Sleep Powder Chlorophyll user is just something that works pretty well in a doubles format. Now, this does get access to Solar Beam, which does synergize quite well with its ability, giving it some very strong grass-type offense. However, generally Leaf Storm has been considered the better option to go for, because it does hit a little bit harder, and it is not dependent on weather like Solar Beam is. And on the poison type side, Sludge Bomb is typically the way to go, and as some coverage, this does get access to Earth Power. Some other interesting moves it gets is Weather Ball, which I'm not sure if it would keep that in Gen 9 or not, and Helping Hand for a little bit of support options. Venusaur really does not have the most impressive moveset. If you look at it, it's pretty basic. But Grass Poison is a relatively good typing, and this Pokemon is essentially a replacement for Lilligant and or Amoonguss, because while it's not as good of a support as Amoonguss is, those fast Sleep Powders are still quite threatening, and the typing is a little better than Lilligant, even if Lilligant's faster. I know in Gen 8's meta this was in almost every Sun team you could imagine, even in the restricted meta when Groudon was the common Sunsetter. You would oftentimes see Venusaur right there with it. So this Pokemon definitely has a lot of potential, and it will maintain that potential in Gen 9, but it has some more caveats now than it used to because of Pokemon like Fluttermane, which Fluttermane doesn't necessarily have the greatest offense into Venusaur, but Venusaur does not have the greatest offense into Fluttermane either. So I could actually see Venusaur being run physical in Scarlet and Violet just to be able to answer Pokemon like Fluttermane and Iron Hands better. And it has enough physical attack to make that work while still having the very threatening fast Sleep Powders. Though I think the biggest problem with Venusaur is how predictable it is. It kind of does one thing, and rarely has it ever played any different than what you expect it to do. It just commonly did not have much mix-up options outside of switching its item. And I do think some of that predictability would also be an issue in Scarlet and Violet. So a little bit different, because having the option to change its Terra type could give it some very interesting play around specific weathers. Because you could run this a water Terra type and have Terra Blast on it, and then put it in a dual weather team. So there are definitely some options to be explored with Venusaur whenever it does arrive in Scarlet and Violet, assuming it does anyway. But I do think the Paradox forms do limit its potential a bit and kind of bring it down to the point where it's probably not going to be as common as it used to be. Okay, revisiting Charizard, that fire flying type, which has the best offense of the three. The typings that fire flying is super effective on is not that impressive in Gen 9, but the relatively low amount of resist is quite nice to have. This is an interesting defensive typing, because while you do have the 4 times from Rock, you're only weak to 2 other typings. And there's the ground immunity with 6 resist, 2 of those being 4 times resist. Even though bug doesn't really matter that much, grass matters a little bit more. So defensively, this typing is an odd mix of being good defensively and bad defensively. It really just depends on what's in front of you, because if you're fighting, say, a mono rock type, like, I don't know, Garganackle, you're probably gonna want a Terra type that can actually hit it for any reasonable amounts of damage, such as Steel, which in that scenario, Steel or Fighting would probably be very well suited there. Now, I could also see just running Fire Terra type on this, which we will get into that in a little bit, but another good option would be Grass to basically cover all of its weaknesses and give you that Sleep Powder and Spore immunity. Now, Charizard actually is in Gen 9 currently, it's just not legal for competitive play yet. And it does have the typical Blaze, as every fire type starter has, and its hidden ability is Solar Power, which this is a brutal ability because your special attack gets a considerable improvement when you're in sunlight. You just take damage every turn for being in sunlight. And this pairs quite well with its reasonably high 109 special attack. Now, this Pokemon speed stat is not as great in Gen 9 as it used to be in other games, just because Paradox forms introduced some much faster threats. This is speed tied with the Goldfish, which I do find quite interesting. And the rest of the stats are fine, it's all in like the 70s and 80s, though I definitely would suggest running this as a special attacker instead of a physical attacker. Now, this does have pretty good stab moves in the form of Heat Wave, Air Slash, as well as Flamethrower, and more powerful moves like Overheat, Blast Burn, and Hurricane. And the support moves are not too bad either. We do have access to Will-O-Wisp as well as Helping Hand, and given its relatively decent speed stats, Scary Face could also be an option. And if you really want to get funny, this does have access to Counter as well as Belly Drum, which could make a physical Charizard quite scary, and that's definitely not a very consistent option to run just because Rock Slide would completely eliminate that strategy. And it had this option in Gen 8, and I never saw a Belly Drum Charizard in Gen 8, so I imagine it's still not the best option to go for even now, but it is definitely something to consider. Now, I know back in Gen 8, Charizard used to run Ancient Power quite often as a way to answer other Charizards. I imagine you would not be running Ancient Power in Gen 9, just because with the Terastallized gimmick, there's much better ways of getting offensive coverage. Aside from that, its moveset's really not that impressive. You do get a lot of physical attacks if you wanted to run a Belly Drum Charizard, but given how inconsistent that option is, I just don't think it's really worth playing into, unless you're going for a fun gimmicky team. Where Charizard really shines is run special with Solar Power in Sunlight, and I guess that's a pun, because you have very high amounts of special offense there, and running this Terra Fire, your offense in Sunlight would be stronger than that of Torkoal by a considerable amount. But even though Charizard does not have access to Eruption, its Heat Wave would probably be hitting harder than Torkoal's Eruption given all the extra boosts that Charizard has access to, as well as just the higher base special attack stat to begin with. And Heat Wave is not stat dependent, so it can actually take damage and still have the same amount of offense. And it also has those really strong flying type moves, so your Air Slash would actually be hitting quite hard as well. I think this Pokemon would make a really nice sweeper. It certainly was in Gen 8, and I don't see that changing for Gen 9. It may be a little more difficult to get it functioning just right because there are more answers to this Pokemon's mode, such as a Flutter Mane with Power Gem or just Palafin in general. Those are both great options to answer Charizard. So for that reason, Charizard may actually need a defensive Terra type to be useful, but it still would have a lot of offense, and that Terra Blast would be quite devastating if it's a super effective hit. The only issue is the Ruinous Legendary Chi-Yu kind of plays its role. It has the same speed stat. It has an ability that gives it very good offense, but it's not weather dependent. That combined with its even higher 135 special attack stat, and having a more flexible typing in the form of Fire Dark, it may technically be better to just run the Goldfish instead of Charizard. And it would still get a boost from Sun on its Fire type attacks, and that Heat Wave would probably be hitting just as hard as Charizard, if not even harder than Charizard. So I don't think Charizard is going to be in quite as good of a spot as it used to be. It's no longer essential for a Sun team to have a Charizard, because just Sun teams in general are not as strong as they used to be. Even though Torkoal can be quite impressive, it's also easier to deal with Torkoal than it used to be. I imagine Charizard's still quite good, and you will definitely see Charizard around here and there, but I don't expect it to be at the same level that it used to be. I really don't expect any of these starters to be quite as good as they were in Gen 8. Gen 9 is just such a different game. There's a lot of strong options that got added that other gens have never seen before, that were so different that they kind of power crawled a lot of the less consistent options out. And while these Gen 1 starters, they all have potential, and there's definitely modes that you can set them up to where they're going to be very helpful in a Gen 9 team, I do not expect any of them to become a focal point of a Gen 9 team. And I really do not see any of them having a utilization at or above 10%. Though there is some speculation we'll see paradox forms of these, which that would be quite interesting. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.